ideology, well, it missed all that, didn't it? But I said, how did the German guards treat you? We know they had this ideology of tall, blonde, blue hair, blue-eyed, perfection and so forth that most Europeans didn't fulfill. So surely a man of color like him, standing at only 5'6", 5'5", I must tell you, I did take pleasure that I was taller than he was, with somebody. But I said, how did they treat you? And Colonel Jefferson, I never forget these words. He said, the German guards in a prisoner of war camp in Europe he said, I was treated better there than I was back in America. I had never heard more of an indictment of the country in that period than that. That a black man as a prisoner by America's arch enemy was treated better by the guards in a prisoner of war camp than he was a free man in his own country. I don't know how you could better sum it up, the state of affairs. But Deanna didn't take the picture. I wish she had taken the picture where it showed Colonel Jefferson with his fist beside my jaw. But she got this one instead. So I wanted you all to see that. China, Burma, India, Part 4. CBI, as they called it. I found some new information while putting this together. There's so much to know about this theater of World War II. I think we've seen this map before of the occupation of China from 1900 to 1949. And you see the shaded areas where the Japanese had infiltrated. Did I miss something?
No,
Probably
you
did,
didn't. You're doing great.
Okay. Thanks. Oftentimes when you're doing research and looking up information about the China, Burma, India theater, you'll see the word Assam and Kunming. So I asked a basic question, where is Assam? And Assam, it turns out, is in this northeastern corner of India. I don't know if that's actually India, but it's where, as you can see right there, right around the area of modern-day Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal. This is tough terrain. This is difficult terrain. This is called the roof of the world, the Himalaya Mountains. And the people who flew the air transport planes, now Kunming in China is located there. I thought it might be interesting if we put both of those together. So there's Yunnan, which is the other place, and Kunming. So these pilots were flying the hump, the roof of the world, from Assam to Yunnan, Kunming. And you don't have to go very far. Just look on the map and see where it says Bangladesh, Bhutan. They're flying across that terrain into China. That's at least what? So they're flying across from Bangladesh, Bhutan, across Myanmar. Today it was once called Burma. That's 1, 2, 3 countries at least. Some of the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. And they did this on a regular basis for several years. Those are the two maps side by side. And I wondered again, what kind of courage is it that inhabits the kind of people that do this kind of thing? Or is it something just as fundamental as, you know what, it's just something you have to do, so you go ahead and do it. That's part of it. But even so, there's still an element of courage and vision there. This shows the air route, another representation of the air route. And you see that up there, right around where it says Lido, the Lido Road. This is where American engineers had to build a road from those areas to Kunming. Again, how do you build a road through that kind of an area? Here, through here, all around through there, all at the same time while people are trying to kill you. And if the people aren't trying to kill you, the jungle's trying to kill you. So you're fighting nature and the worst predator on earth, humanity. If you see that little airplane, that gives you another representation of the air route that these pilots flew. Again, finding new information. I absolutely did not know about this particular museum. Being from the DC area, I of course am well familiar with the Smithsonian Air Museum. It is a wonderful place. I've gone there and spent days in that museum and still haven't gotten enough. But out in California, apparently there's a place called the Lion Air Museum that has a lot of World War II vintage aircraft, like this DC-3, which was converted into a C-47, the C-47 Skytrain that flew across the hump. Then the twin-engine B-25. We recall that that was the one that was used in April 1942 for the Doolittle raid. They called it a medium bomber. I think this is an AT-6 Texan, which was used for pilot training. This, the B-26 Marauder. A C-47. Lots and lots of aircraft in this museum. A beautiful display. From the website, from the Lion Air Museum, it pointed out that the China-Burma-India Theater was established officially on June 22nd, 1942. So roughly about 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it has been known and still is referred to as the Forgotten Theater, hence our covering of that Forgotten Theater. That's why we wanted to talk about it. At the height of World War II, out of all the Americans in the Army, this is a stunning statistic. Because by the end of World War II, we will have 12 million men and women in uniform. And out of that 12 million number, only 250,000, about 2%, were assigned to the CBI theater. Now, when you consider the number of Japanese troops that they held down, that they kept confined to that area, 250,000 against millions, including the terrain and the jungle, the importance of this theater becomes more and more important. It elevates commensurately. It goes on to say that the CBI veterans were and are truly unique. Thousands of men, many were mostly boys, were assigned to U.S. Army Air Force units serving the CBI theater of war. There's something called the Air Transport Command, flew supplies over the hump from India to China. A unit, the 341st Bomb Group. Now we know that eventually, General Claire Chennault, we talked about him as being the founder of the Flying Tigers, when he eventually is taken back into the Army, and the formal unit that he commands becomes the 14th Air Force. Part of that, I believe, was the 341st Bomb Group, which was assigned to obviously destroy Japanese facilities and supplies. The Lion Air Museum points out that the Flying Tigers fought the Japanese over China and Burma, and they fought to support on the ground Merrill's Marauders and the Mars Task Force. Now, what is the Mars Task Force? In 1944, when General Merrill's Marauders was eventually disbanded. They did some amazing things. They did a 1,000-mile march that we talked about the last time, but they were eventually disbanded. When they were disbanded, they were reorganized into something called the Mars Task Force. I tried, please believe me, I tried to find out why do they call it Mars. I can only figure it must have been because where they were located, they must have felt like they were on Mars. That's one explanation, but probably not the right one. Either way, you should know that Merrill's Marauders, they fell apart. They were reorganized into a number of other different units, with some Chinese units incorporated, some Burmese units incorporated, and they were called the Mars Task Force. And the 341st and the Air Transport Command were all involved in supporting these guys on the ground. And they fought through the jungles of Burma. And then, as we pointed out, U.S. Army engineers built the Burma-Lido Road to open up a land supply route. And while I do not really try to do stuff verbatim, this was worth reading verbatim. These men served their country well. They overcame the hardships, accepted their sacrifices, and performed their duties with courage and skill. In spite of their youth and naivete, and despite the isolation of being halfway around the world from those they have vowed to protect, each of them accepted that freedom is worth fighting and perhaps dying for. Their outstanding accomplishments in arguably one of the most difficult theaters of the war emphasized the courage, dedication, and ingenuity of all the World War II veterans who defended an ideal in our way of life. I told the students in my modern European class in my U.S. history class yesterday. We watched a brief clip from that miniseries Band of Brothers, and it was that portion that showed the American soldiers liberating a concentration camp. I said to them, you have to understand that I read that it wasn't until 1950 that the U.S. Census Bureau actually gathered statistics showing that most Americans up until then had lived in places like Holland, Michigan, Zeeland. It's not until 1950 that the paradigm begins to shift, and you find more and more Americans living in urban centers like New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco. So that meant that when those soldiers went into that concentration camp to liberate those Jewish prisoners, those people who had been starved to death or starved to the point of death, there's nothing in the experience of any of those soldiers that prepared them for the horror that they were about to encounter in that moment. And I say, you can't be 20 years old and see that and come back and think you're going to be the same. You simply cannot. Nothing's prepared you for that. Likewise, if you're at Incheon in 1950, when you land on those beaches and the North Koreans are throwing everything they have at you, you can't come back the same as a 20-year-old. If you're in Vietnam for any length of time as a 20-year-old, you don't come back the same. I'm trying to get them to understand that the people who did the heavy lifting in World Wars I, II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, such a small percentage of our population had done such an outsized job of protecting all of us.
I'm listening and doing emails, multitasking and not doing anyone. Great.
And they persist no matter what challenges they have confronted. And they just keep on doing their job and making it happen. The Air Transport Command was a major part of what was going on in Burma. And what I want to do is show a brief video. So this gives you this. I was going to try and do this, but this guy gives. You can tell it's a 1940s type of video. So it has all the heroic music. I might say heroic cheesy music.
Have 5 C-47s stand by to load special cargo.
Prepare to load 4 B-24s with rush cargo for Special Project 302.
Cargo for Special Project 302 will be delivered at airport at 1640 EWT.
In this historic hurry call for munitions for a fighting ally lay the first severe test of the Army's fledgling Air Transport Command. A call to deliver within 72 hours by air and by air alone, 25,000 rounds of armor-piercing anti-tank ammunition to General Auchinleck's men in Egypt. On that black day, Hitler's Africa Corps was but 70 miles from Alexandria, key to the Middle East, to Suez, and to India. Rommel believed victory to be within his grasp. But with their ammunition supply replenished and their courage unimpaired, the gunners of the British Eighth Army stopped Rommel's army in its tracks and turned the tide of the Desert War. The fledgling Air Transport Command of 1942 became, in time, the world's greatest airline. Its bases circled the earth. Its thousands of Army and civilian pilots grew as familiar with Karachi, Cairo, and Kunming as with New York, Los Angeles, or Albuquerque. Flying key military personnel and high-priority freight from continent to continent became a commonplace. Among the duties ATC took on was the rapid transportation of war supplies, drugs to save the lives of fighting men, thousands of critical items of equipment needed to keep bombers and fighters in action in distant war zones. Another of its duties was to assure a continual flow of combat planes to the fighting front. To this end, ATC's ferrying division flew hundreds of planes a week from the factories to operating bases in distant combat zones. In addition, many a combat plane was flown by its own crew over routes laid out for ATC cargo planes. Planes which would have taken months to arrive by sea have been delivered ready for battle in a matter of days or even hours. And in the war's crucial period, when the ferrying division was created, the saving of a few hours more than once made all the difference between victory and defeat in local actions. Within quick reach by air ferry were such distant points as Australia or China, where for months Chenault's Flying Tigers stood alone as a token of America's promised aid. Building up the organization needed for operations on so vast a scale was a job of pioneering.
It is worth noting that the experience that was gotten by the Air Transport Command
Principles and techniques
during this period became very valuable in the post-war period in 1948, 1949, during that thing that we remember as the Berlin airlift. One aircraft that was flown by the Air Transport Command was the C-46 Commando. There were a number of others that you saw in the video, the C-54 Cargo Master, C-47. I think I pointed that out in the part about the Lion Air Museum. We'll come back to this C-46 in just a moment. Besides its designated name, the C-46 Commando, the men who flew in these aircraft also referred to them as the Whale, the Curtis Calamity, the Plumber's Nightmare, and the Flying Coffin. So if you're flying a C-46 over the Himalaya mountains, this is not encouraging, to say the least. Remember I showed you all the picture of the Brewster Buffalo? Who are the people that make these aircraft? And then why do people let them make them? Some things to know about the China-Burma-India theater and the men who flew the hump. People generally hear a lot about the bomber groups of airmen who devastated the Japanese home islands. But as we have indicated, as we have pointed out, the people that flew around the China-Burma-India theater are not so well known. They built a 1,000-mile road and flew over the Himalaya foothills to keep China in the fight. Crucial to knowing this also, obviously China is a vast country, but this is the statistic that really caught my eye. 3 million Chinese soldiers kept 1.25 million Japanese troops in China away from the ever-creeping allies who were taking island after island, slowly getting closer to the Japanese mainland. So from the beginning of the war, from the Doolittle Raid, which is April 1942, the spring of 1942, to the first the major land invasion to seize territory from the Japanese, which means August 7th, 1942, the invasion, the landing at Guadalcanal, was turned into its own big drama in securing Henderson Airfield and establishing the first of many points to literally have island by island movement back toward the Japanese home islands, which happens during the Marianas Campaign when they finally get close enough to take advantage of all the experience of the European air war, everything they learned flying B-17s and B-24s in that conflict, and they built it into the B-29, which finally had the altitude and the range, but most of all the firepower to deliver to Japan a series of blows that would precede the final blow, the atomic bomb. A second fact to know about this theater. The mountain ranges cause jet stream strength winds and dangerous weather at high altitudes. So scholars have asked, imagine yourself in something called the Flying Coffin above the Himalaya mountains with jet stream strength force winds and extreme altitudes. So along with the weather, where the Japanese fighter pilots are out to make a kill, transport pilots, in some cases, facing headwinds, plodded along at ground speeds of 30 miles per hour, while the wind lifted their planes to 28,000 feet and then dropped them back down to 6,000 feet shortly thereafter. Have you ever been aboard an airplane where it kind of like suddenly goes up, then down? Do you notice everybody's lunch on the floor? That's what that must have been like. There were also ice storms and thunderstorms they had to deal with. Another fact. Many of the pilots who flew the hump were new. We're not talking about skilled pilots, new pilots. Another factor, the high altitude flying caused a loss of oxygen, which distorted brain function and judgment, which led people to forget where they were. So mistakes in navigation, mistakes in altitude, mistakes of terrain, lots of crashes into mountains. Young, new, roof of the world, high altitudes, jet stream winds, questionable aircraft. 1/3 of the men flying the hump died while doing so. A fourth factor, something called the Kandaki River Gorge. I did not know about this. But this gorge, which extends many, many miles, is deeper than the Grand Canyon. And so they flew along this route, sometimes on purpose, sometimes by accident. The Kandaki River Gorge is much wider and deeper than the Grand Canyon. The mountains surrounding the gorge were 10,000 feet higher than most of the planes could fly. The pass to escape the gorge was 15,000 feet, but pilots often couldn't see it. So there you are, high altitude, inexperienced. The mountains of the gorge are 10,000 feet higher than you are. So you literally can't even fly higher than the terrain feature. I tried to imagine what is this like. The only thing I can give you is an experience I had aboard the USS Incheon, a helicopter aircraft carrier in the Norwegian Sea during Operation Northern Wedding Beauregard in the late 80s, early 90s. And I remember going from below decks onto the actual helicopter aircraft deck, and the ship was really moving in erratic fashion. And I went up topside, and I saw that a wave was up higher than the ship. Now, the helicopter aircraft carrier is not a small ship. It's big. And there was a wave that looked to me like a mountain. It was higher than the ship. And I said, the only thing I can do is just go back below and wait. That's what I did. I said, God, just please come and find me. But I cannot imagine what it must have been like to be flying in that gorge with the mountains being higher than 10,000 feet than you could go in the pass to escape the gorge, 15,000 feet, and you can't see it. The pilots were issued fleece-lined jackets, boots, and gloves to keep their extremities from freezing during the flight. As I mentioned, a lack of oxygen could cause pilots to veer off course, and of course that could mean flying into a mountain, risking death. The C-46s, the flying coffins, they didn't glide. Their engines were so heavy that they almost caused them almost immediately to go into a dive if they lost power. Once out of fuel, crews had to bail out with minimal protection, cold weather gear, and 9 rounds of a .45 caliber pistol. I thought it might be worthwhile to take a look at, well, we know what cold is. We live in Michigan, right? Okay. I think I was just frustrated by the fact that winter's coming. But in a B-17, to give you an idea of the kind of equipment that these pilots and crews had to wear, in the air war over Europe, B-17 crews, this is a waist gunner of a B-17, usually had to wear fleece-lined jackets with boots. Imagine wearing a ski suit, except it's twice as thick, and you have the boots. Now, my question is this. I have seen a 50 caliber machine gun. I fired a 50 caliber machine gun. I'm wondering, even with the handles and grips as big as a 50 is, how do you hold on to a 50 caliber machine gun at 26, 27,000 feet? It's freezing cold up there. You got an oxygen mask on, goggles, because at that altitude, the freezing cold can do something to your vision as well. So you have goggles on, and then you have German fighters that are coming at you, throwing everything they got at you, to include rockets, and you're trying to shoot at them. How do you maintain your own stability? How do you take aim? How do you fire the trigger? These young people did it. I think back to the statistic I read that the average age of a B-17 pilot and co-pilot was right around 24 years old. And the average age of a waist gunner was 19 years old. And then, in addition to all that, you're cramped together because airplane fuselages, especially military aircraft, are not that big to begin with. And they're a lot bigger today than they used to be. World War II type, when human beings, Americans, were smaller, just generally speaking, because of the diets and whatnot, and because we still hadn't had certain advances in health. So you have smaller people flying aircraft even so. And you need to also remember that while they're in a full-fledged firefight in the air, every time those 50 caliber machine guns are firing, they're firing from belts of ammunition. Those machine guns are expending or shooting out spent rounds, so there's brass on the floor of the fuselage as well. So you're in those boots, and you have these round things. It's like standing on top of a bunch of pool hall balls. And the confusion, and the fear, and the adrenaline. You don't have that over China, Burma, India, but you do have the mountains in the distance, and the knowledge that you can't afford to make a mistake. This is what I mean about the spent rounds. And if you add the fact that there will be wounded and or killed, dead and dying on board the aircraft as well, it should remove any kind of feeling or kind of thought that people have that somehow the air war was somehow less traumatic, less dynamic, less dangerous than the war on the ground. So air crews definitely did not care for the C-46 Commando. But I wanted us to take a moment while we were talking about all this, just to go back and take a look at, this is what people are facing in China, Burma, India. We talked about Merrill's Marauders. We talked about Claire Chanel. We talked about Flying Tigers. We talked about a lot of stuff relative to this theater. But if you take that theater, everything we've talked about, and add it to the European theater of war, look at that. You got Europe, obviously. You see there where it says USSR, that's the Soviet Union. And that line that pushes right up to Moscow, Lenin was under siege for 2 years at least. Leningrad was under siege for 2 years. The Nazis got to within almost seizing Moscow. Of course, down to the southeast was the Battle of Stalingrad, from November 1942 to February 1943, still not only the epic battle of World War II, but probably the most existentially difficult battle in all of human history, and there have been a lot of them that compete, believe me. And you take that, and then add in Turkey, add in Syria, that means the Middle East, and then you have the field operations in North Africa. That's one continent and another continent. Then add the Pacific theater. What's going on? The west coast of the United States and Alaska, China, you got East Asia, Southeast Asia, Australasia, and then add to that the China, Burma, India theater. World War II was truly a global conflict. Truly it was. It is astonishing to look at the land area and then the sea area, if you add the Pacific, the amount of area, space on the globe that human beings subjected to combat and conflict. For 4 years sustained. The sixth, No search and rescue. If a crew crashed or bailed out, there would be no search and rescue in the freezing cold or if you crashed into enemy territory, because the rescue crews would be subject to the same freezing cold temperatures, rough terrain, and the same threat from the enemy that a crew that bails out would be. So basically, if you bailed out, if you crashed, if you survived the crash, you were on your own. But the planners didn't fail to take that into account. They provided them training. In the event that you had to bail out or crash, they taught people how to take a bullet and end their lives rather than be captured. So now, these airmen will not come back. They'll not come back from China, Burma, India the same. I mentioned to you all when we started that I wanted to, in addition to talking about the fighting and the strategy and all other stuff that happened relative to China, Burma, India, and we're gonna get back at that. But it wasn't it wasn't just flying the hump. It wasn't just Merle's Marauders. It wasn't just the Mars Task Force. It wasn't just holding the Japanese at bay. It wasn't just providing a geostrategic alternative where 3 million Chinese soldiers locked down 1.25 million Japanese soldiers. Also in the China, Burma, India theater, other things going on. How do you keep people sustained? How do you keep people's spirits up? How do you keep them emotionally together while they're doing that fighting the Japanese, fighting the terrain, fighting the altitude, fighting the jungle, fighting nature itself trying to kill them? So many different things trying to take them out. How do they keep it together here and here? And for that, there was an individual named Father Emil Joseph Kapan. Joseph Kapan was born in Pilsen, Kansas. And this is the church where he used to minister. St. John P. Church, Holy Family Parish, Pilsen, home of Father Emil Kapan. Pilsen is a Czechoslovakian immigrant community that was founded in 1874. In 1888, the first church was a 2-story frame building. Then they built another one in 1894, large enough to seat an entire congregation. In 1915, a third church was built. Then an adjacent rectory, which now has a museum devoted to Father Kapan. He grew up in the church, was briefly its pastor. This is a view inside the church. Isn't that some beautiful architecture? Father Kapan has many stories about him. One day when his mother was ill and Kapan attempted to milk a cow instead of his mother, the cow wouldn't stand still for him, so he went back inside, put on his mother's dress, went back out to the cow. The cow recognized his mother, him, and then let him milk her. As someone who was not raised on a farm, all I could say was, "You got to be kidding me." Cows can recognize people like that? Apparently so. This is a picture of Father Kapan in seminary. At seminary, he stood out, and his friends talked about him, how he was always there to help them out. He had a reputation for being a good student, offering his notes. In other words, being someone that people could come to already, a friend to the friendless, and just somebody who's always giving his heart. This is Father Kapan, or Emil Kapan, and his mother, Bessie, prior to his ordination in 1939, the year that World War II broke out. And then in 1940, you see him here playing baseball with some school kids. Assigned to his home parish, that word, where children came to play at recess. And here he is presiding over a wedding ceremony. Father Kapan, like a lot of Americans when World War II started, did not want to just sit on the side, so he enlisted. And here you see him celebrating Mass at Harrington Air Base, Kansas. It was after Father Kapan saw the need for military chaplains while serving in Harrington that he felt the call to become a military chaplain, so that's what he did. You see here the newly minted Father Second Lieutenant Emil Kapan. While Father Kapan is getting into the military, and he will eventually be assigned to wear the China-Burma-India theater to minister to soldiers in that region. While the war's going on, February 1943, Guadalcanal is finally secured. Another area that doesn't get a whole lot of coverage, and really should, relative to World War II, the Pacific Campaign, were the operations that took place at Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. They also were very critical, at least at one time thought to be critical, to seizing, to get close to the Japanese, but they seized the Allies seized those islands. There was some bitter fighting there in the Northern Territories, and they get another area where it got really, really cold. Here you see men carrying howitzer ammunition ashore to supply guns. Foggy, terrible conditions, hard for landing conditions. In April 1943, Admiral Yamamoto was intercepted by two P-38 Lightnings that shot him down. As Japanese radio traffic had been intercepted, Yamamoto was going on a tour throughout the Pacific to try and bolster the flagging spirits of Japanese soldiers. Americans intercepted the transmission, found out where he was going to be going. They sent two P-38 Lightnings and got him. There's a book, if you're interested in such things, there is a book entitled Get Yamamoto. Not very imaginative, but it does get to the point. On October 26, 1943, while Father Kapan is in China-Burma-India theater, Emperor Hirohito made this message, or made this comment: Japan's situation is now very grave. And keep in mind, it's still about a year and a half before the war is lost. Japan's situation is now very grave, so in 1944, they unleashed the human bombs, the flying bombs, the kamikaze. The war in the Pacific was taking an even more desperate turn. This is where I began to realize that those 1.25 million Japanese soldiers that could have been here fighting against these guys were held in place by the Chinese and the Americans in the China-Burma-India theater. So all those people flying across the hump, all those people doing their job, engaging them in the jungles of Burma, China, and as far as in Myanmar, they were doing a real significant service by allowing other forces to keep moving forward without those other troops, the other Japanese troops. Because those Japanese troops in China, Burma, India, they weren't just battle-hardened. Those are some of the most experienced Japanese soldiers in the entire Japanese army. Though we need to remember that Japan invaded China first, early on in the 1930s. So those troops that had been in China for a long, long time, they were some of the best they had, and certainly some of the most experienced that they'd had. We have talked about the hump. As has been noted, America's major contribution during that war for the CBI were materials and manpower and air and land lift capability. Relative to Father Kapan, this guy right here, Tech Sergeant 4th Class Howard Sherman with the Italian missionary Father Mongesi. This guy recalls, I had been helping Father Edward Glavin, Catholic chaplain, serve Mass when he was in our area. He introduced me to Father Kapan, and we struck up a great friendship. When Father Glavin received orders to move out, Father Kapan asked me to continue assisting in Mass. We traveled to 2 missions in the area. We met a priest and nuns from Italy who had established missions in Laosio and Namtu, Burma. Not only did Father Kapan minister to our troops, he also helped the local missions in many ways. I don't know about you all, but with everything I read about the China-Burma-India theater and World War II in general, to see this American Catholic priest who got around by riding a bike, going around and conducting services for people, It was utterly stunning to me. So there he was in the midst of wartime doing these kind of things. He took up a collection among the troops and turned over a tidy sum to the missionaries. At his request, engineers went in and built a nice building for the mission for use as a church and school. Father Mungesi, the missionary priest at Laosho, appreciated the help that Father Capon gave him. I continued to assist Father Capon when he was in our area. He had a territory of over 2,000 miles to cover from Lido to Laosho. Now, we've heard about the Lido Road, right? The Lido Road. So Father Capon is covering that area as well, and did so mainly by jeep. He enjoyed his beer and the pipe. When I read that, I liked him better. When we received our rations, we shared them with him, and there was one when he brought his rations with me and my buddies. September 2nd, 1945, of course, the war ends. This is a Japanese delegation aboard the USS Missouri, and General MacArthur, and other dignitaries. Here we see the Soviet representative signing the surrender document, the British representative, and then the Cold War began. Father Capon, after World War II, had been promoted to captain and continued to serve in the China-Burma India Theater until May 1946, long after most other Americans had gone home. He was finally released from duty in July 1946. He went home and went to college under the GI Bill, earning a master's degree in education in February 1948. He attended the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. Father Capon kept in touch with his wartime colleagues. See if I can read this. Dear Howard and family, your card and letter were really a joy to me, for it is well to hear from old friends. I sure am glad that you have a nice home in which you are living. Maybe after things get back to normal, your wish for a house of your own will be fulfilled. Yes, we sure hope that someday things will get normal again. He could be speaking today, couldn't he? Many thanks, Howard, for the invitation to visit your folks. I'm going to try to accept that invitation, but I can't say when now, but when I do come, I insist on not causing you folks any trouble, for the visit will be only a short one, and I sure would like to meet your family and to talk over, I think that says Burmese times with you, those good missionaries. You sure are taking a great interest in them, Howard. God bless you for that. I sent the good sisters some books which they requested. It probably will be take a long time for the books to get to Burma. May this year, 1947, be a blessed one, successful one for all of you. For me, university life is sometimes a little rough, but it is a swell opportunity to be here. This letter, meant to be short, Howard. God bless you. I'll let you know, as ever, in Christ, Father Emil J. Capon. Father Capon graduated successfully from Catholic University. And in April 1948, his bishop appointed him a pastor in Timken, Kansas, and he still felt called to be a chaplain to the troops. In September 1948, the bishop approved it, so Father Capon rejoined the Army as a chaplain, just in time to be part of the Korean conflict. He was ordered to Japan. North Korea attacked June 25th. Father Capon was assigned to a frontline combat unit. His friend Howard said, I continued to hear from him after the war while he attended the Catholic University in Washington. He was planning to visit me at my home in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, when I last corresponded with him. Because of his recall to his home area, he was unable to make the trip. I next heard from him after he decided to go back to the Army chaplain school. He wrote me from Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas, telling me of his decision and his desire to serve the troops once more during the Korean War. Shortly after Christmas 1949, I received a card from him telling me he was on his way to Japan. You see the Korean Peninsula there. And we're going to take a look at also, in that little inset, you can see where Korea is relative to Japan. North Korea, South Korea. The thing about Father Capon, and the thing that I wanted to do in mentioning him was this. We get an idea of how Father Capon was an asset to the troops in China, Burma, India, for those he contacted, based on what he eventually did in Korea. Father Capon was caught in North Korea late in the war after the Chinese came in on the side of the North Koreans. His unit was surrounded. A Chinese soldier was about to shoot an American prisoner in the head when Father Capon walked up to the Chinese soldier and said, "No, you don't." Pushed the rifle away, got in between the soldier and the Chinese soldier. The Chinese soldier was utterly stunned. I was wondering, who is this guy, and is he crazy? That soldier did not die. Father Capon was taken prisoner with everybody else. And it's also important to note that before the capture, before this unit was surrounded by Chinese soldiers, the order came down for everybody who was able to get on transport and leave. There were a lot of American soldiers who had been wounded or who were cold and simply just could not move. I hate to say this, but they were slated to be left behind. Father Capon stayed with them. They were captured. He stayed with them. They were taken to a prisoner of war camp. While there, he ministered to them. He performed mass. We know that the communist Chinese do not have necessarily a faith system that we recognize, but they ordered him to stop doing it because in communism, apparently, you can't have any kind of allegiance to anybody but the state. They told him to quit doing it. He didn't. The prisoners built a cross out of wood and barbed wire. Father Capon was eventually stripped naked in the cold of Korea and thrown into what they called a starvation room or building and kept on ministering mass. He was eventually, of course, fell deeply, deeply ill and died. How could he not? A few years ago, the soldiers who were prisoners with him remembered his heroism. They had been lobbying Congress and other officials for years to recognize Father Capon, and he finally, I think that he's finally going to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously. That kind of heroism that Father Capon displayed in Korea out of a heart like that is similar to what he gave troops while in the China, Burma, India theater. We will return to the fighting and some more like that, because I want to talk about Colonel Robert L. Scott next. Some of you mentioned him. He's the one who was in the Army Air Force that eventually wrote the book, God is My Co-Pilot, after which there was a movie made. Some of you all are nodding your head, you know about that. You've seen it probably. I want to talk about Colonel Scott and the final stages of the China, Burma, India theater, because as World War II came to a close, there was a movement, geostrategists were looking at using China as a launch point for attacking Japan, understandably. But the success of the island campaigns, getting close to getting in the Marianas, and the B-29s finally having the range and the capability to get to the Japanese home island of the main island of Honshu, pretty much scrapped that. So what you ended up with were those 1.25 million Japanese soldiers who effectively were stranded now on mainland China. Can you think of anything more ironically appropriate? That the people that had caused such misery in China now couldn't get away from it. And so they were there, and those 3 million Chinese troops and those American and British troops and those Indian troops kept them anchored right there so the other part of the Pacific War could go on and continue to knock Japan out of World War II. We will discuss that overall geostrategic reality and the night ran for the Japanese next week. Thanks. Questions? Yes.
Were there women involved in the CBI theater, and if so, in what ways?
Women were involved in the CBI theater, particularly when it came to what's called the ferrying division of the Air Transport Command. So the Air Transport Command, turns out, had a ferrying division that was assigned to do just one thing: take airplanes, B-24s, B-17s, C-47s, and literally fly them from one point to the other. That's how you have the buildup of the different air forces in different theaters of war. I've often wondered how the B-17s of the 8th Air Force how do you have an Air Force and take it from 0 to nothing? Well, it was this ferrying command that was flying airplanes across the Atlantic Ocean. I've seen maps of where the ferrying command flew aircraft across the Arctic Circle because it was considered to be safer, shorter. They would fly over Greenland. So women did part of that. Now, I don't know how often they did it, but they definitely did. They definitely were part of the ferrying. As far as actual on the ground fighting in China, Burma, India, I'm not sure how many, although women were involved among the Chinese forces in fighting the Japanese. Yes?
Several years ago, I met a nurse who flew over the hump with injured patients. She wrote a small memoir book, which I read. I don't remember her name or much more about it, but she made many trips with
Really? That's fascinating. The comment was that, how many years ago was it?
oh, probably, well, that I met her,
Mhm.
probably a dozen years ago.
About 12 years ago, she met a nurse who flew over the hump several times tending to wounded patients, right? So yeah, that must have been an amazing trip for her to do that. So clearly women were involved in doing that kind of thing. It's this whole, one of the things that my students are looking at in the U.S. military course right now, I had them read an article or watch a couple of videos about women who are going through infantry training in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps has finally started letting women go through infantry training, what they call the Crucible. And right now they're calling it experimental. Well, for the Russians, it's a done deal. Women participated in combat in World War II. I think I mentioned to you all that the Russians had one female sniper, can't remember her name right now, but she had 309 confirmed kills. And I have another student who's going to be doing a presentation tomorrow on a group of Russian women called the Night Witches. These are Russian female fighter pilots, or Russian women. The Russians had apparently their own version of Amelia Earhart. And during World War II, she kept on, she wrote even Joseph Stalin, which shows how much gut she had, that you had this tremendous resource not being used, and they formed this group of air women or pilots that flew these aircraft that the men didn't want anything to do with. They were light, made out of wood, and literally covered with fabric. So these women used these aircraft. They were so light, they couldn't carry bombs. So what the women would do, they would carry the bombs with their hands apparently, and they flew at night. So the tactic was this: one aircraft piloted by these are like World War I looking aircraft. So they would be in the sky, they'd fly at night over German locations, of course. So one aircraft would cut their engine and glide over, would fly over to let them know that there was an aircraft up there as a decoy. But then the rest of them would cut their engines and glide over and bomb them. So they couldn't be hit, and they did that time and time and time again. And the Germans, the Nazis, started calling these women witches. Now, if a Nazi calls you a witch, that's a compliment. Any from the chat? Questions?
Yes, I just received one in the chat. It is, how and when does India come into play in this conflict?
India comes into play because don't forget that India is a British colony still during World War II. So there are colonial soldiers in World War II. And there are also people called Gurkhas. I read something that said, if you find people who have no fear of combat, they're either lying or they're a Gurkha. So the British, with their Indian colonial allies, were in World War II, and of course, because it was the China, Burma, India theater, they had a tremendous stake in resisting the Japanese.
Great, thanks. That's all I have right now.
Sure. Others?
So what involvement did Japan have in Indochina
Good question, Gary. Japan was,
Can you repeat the question, Fred?
the question was, what involvement did Japan have in Indochina during World War II? The short answer is a lot. The Vietnamese, like other Asian people, the Vietnamese, the Laotians, the Cambodians, the Thais, were all part of what Japan wanted to have control over, and what they were calling, what they intended to have, or what they propagandistically called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Before World War II, Japan, like many non-European nations, was asserting its power and flexing its international muscles, and they were saying things like, well, Asia should be for the Asians. What they meant was that Asia should be for their Asians, for the Japanese. Because all you have to do is take a look at how the Japanese treated the Koreans, particularly Korean and Filipino and Chinese women, to know that they had absolutely no idea, no intention of sharing in the whatever fruits and spoils they intended to get equally with their other Asian neighbors. So they were in Indochina, and in fact, they were in Indochina because they thought that they were entitled to supplant the French as colonial masters. The interesting thing about Indochina is that after World War II, when the Japanese finally get kicked out of Indochina, the French will return to Indochina to reassert their colonial authority, and of course people like Ho Chi Minh will not like that. And early on, the French, soon after World War II, will offer the people in Indochina some limited form of autonomy, and they go, no, that's not what we're talking about. We said no to the Chinese, we said no to the Japanese, we've already said no to you once, we're saying no to you again. And then, of course, Dien Bien Phu in 1954. There is, during a trip to Vietnam in 2019, Dr. Van der Stoep and I took with the students, or should I say, they took with us. Our guide, our contact over there, Tuan, who is, I think, Tuan is the highest ranking UN representative, or one of the highest ranking UN representatives in the country. He showed me, or he let me take pictures of some magazines from something that was called the Vietnam America Friends Association. So I have pictures of articles from 1946 where the Vietnamese government, such as it was then, was reaching out to the United States trying to establish some kind of a connection so that there would be travel between the two countries, diplomatic recognition between the two countries, in other words, to bring them closer together. But there is one exchange between an American intelligence officer who was working for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner of the CIA, where Ho Chi Minh, who worked with the OSS in rescuing downed American pilots in Vietnam, rather in Indochina. So the OSS is helping to coordinate a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese. And they're also working with the Vietnamese to rescue downed American flyers. And this American officer asked Ho Chi Minh, "Are you a communist?" Ho Chi Minh says, "Yes, I am." But that doesn't mean we can't be friends, does it? And the answer was, yes, it does mean that. Already the Cold War was settling in. It was another one of those many instances that showed that Vietnam, who knows, I mean, look, I'm an historian. I can only know what happened. It did happen. But it is very curious to find out that the Vietnamese were making overtures to the Vietnamese America Friends Association, writing articles about how wonderful the relationship would be if we could just get past the World War II smoke and mirrors stuff. And then finally, before the dust settled and the smoke cleared from World War II, communism and hysteria about it were already hijacking American foreign policy and turning what could have been at least a cordial friendship into a hostile one.
You mentioned how well, relatively well, the German captured, people who were captured by the Germans were treated with a little bit of a respect, including African Americans. How about the Japanese, who were people captured by the Japanese?
Well, from what I read at the prisoner of war camp at Cabanatuan in the Philippines, and what I've read about the Bataan Death March and other treatment, how many of you all saw that movie, was it Unbroken? Read the book Unbroken? The Japanese were terrible.
I assume that was very different.
Well, you know, you can get into talking about, the Olympics of pain. And the Nazis, of course, were horrible because they had people like Mengele, right? who were doing experiments on live people. And he's the one that we know about because he's the most atrocious, but there were others. But then in Nanking, in China, you had Unit 731. They were doing the same thing, conducting experiments on people, killing people by burying them alive, by sticking dogs on them, setting them on fire. So the Japanese the Japanese were terrible in their way, and the Nazis were horrible in their way. Get back in front of the camera. Japanese horrible as far as they're concerned. And again, the thing that's so interesting, or one of the many things interesting about the Japanese in the Pacific Theater, is that particularly the way they justified sexual slavery, calling it comfort, trying to put the euphemism of comfort women on there, so as if somehow that would dignify it or make it less terrible. And the fact that during the Cold War, as the Cold War really began to gather some momentum, the Japanese government was kind of given a pass by the US government, or not pressured to recognizing this thing that happened with other Asian peoples, because what became more important was offsetting the Soviet power in East Asia, particularly the Korean Peninsula. It's very similar to what happened with the decision that was made relative to the continent of Africa. Now, the Soviet Union being dominant in Europe and Berlin being deep inside of the Soviet zone of Germany meant then that when African nations that began asking for or seeking for independence during the post-World War II period come to the United States asking for support to get the French out of Mauritania, Mali, Cote d'Ivoire, places like that, and getting the British out of Ghana, Tanzania, and Kenya, the answer is essentially no, because it's more important to keep the French and the British close allies to offset the Russians in Europe. African leaders and independence movements recognize that, and when they finally do gain independence, they join the non-aligned states in the UN and form a voting bloc internationally that has been a thorn in our side ever since. That's more than what you asked for, but I couldn't help it.
Any more comments in chat?
Any more comments in chat?
No.
Okay. I'll see you all next week. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.